Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and today my guest comes from Ottawa, Canada, Selma Incesulu. I love that name.
Okay.
I was wondering how to pronounce it, so it's really musical somehow. Well, welcome to my channel.
Thank you.
And you are a fellow YouTuber, so we're gonna talk about that. But before we jump into your YouTube career, let's talk about your knitting journey. Like, when did you learn how to knit?
So I learned how to knit when I was 9. I remember it. Actually, I remember it bizarrely clearly because I was sitting on my mother's lap in my living room or in our living room, and she had her hands around me and was showing me the mechanics of the knitting. And I never really stopped. The first thing I made when I was 9 was a pot holder for my father, which I made in some sort of wool, and it was orange and brown. It was the 70s. And he used it for decades, actually. So yeah, it started then and it never really stopped, to be honest. I continued knitting on.
Well, I remember hearing you said in one of your podcasts that you knitted your first sweater at like 14.
I did.
Was that
Yeah,
the start of the sweater affair? Because you love knitting sweaters.
I do. It's my favorite thing. It was the beginning. My mother was a very avid knitter, and Vogue knitting was in our house always. She pretty much bought every edition and usually made at least one sweater from Vogue knitting. She would knit for herself, she would knit for me, she would knit for other family members, she would knit for her colleagues. She was a really amazing knitter. And so I think it was just natural that I made my first sweater at that age because that's what I mean, she made all kinds of things, but she made a lot of sweaters and, um, of all kinds, summer, winter, all kinds of different things. So that's where I think the influence came from. And it was my birthday's in June. So it was the summer that I turned 15, I believe. And I have found a picture of me as a teenager in a group of people, and I'm wearing the sweater. But I don't have any. I swore I had another picture of me wearing it somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it. But it was a gray mohair sweater, and that was my first sweater made with mohair, which was probably a little crazy, and it was pieced, and it was a very simple construction. And I remember I struggled, actually. I think I made the ribbing probably multiple times because I couldn't seem to get the knit purl aligned. And um, yeah, that was that was the beginning of it. And even though I struggled, I wore that sweater until it wore out. I loved it and I was proud to wear it.
Was knitting something that's been taught in school during your time?
Not here in Canada. We had home economics, but at the age of 9, I wouldn't have taken that yet. That was more in high school. And they didn't really, if they taught very, very basic things. I don't really remember that. I remember candle making and I remember cooking, but I don't remember being taught knitting, but I would have known how to knit anyway already. So that would have been something that I didn't really need to learn. In Finland, of course, which is where my mother is from and where I was born as well, there it's taught in school, but not here.
Well, did you feel like it was a cool thing to know how to do, or were you laughed at?
I don't remember being laughed at all. It was such an integral part of my family life because my mother knit and my aunt knit, and it was my grandmother knit, everybody knit. So for me, it was very much part of my culture, my domestic culture. And certainly when I made my first sweater, which would have been in high school, my friends thought that was pretty cool. So I ended up teaching a couple of friends how to knit and in this hallway in front of the lockers in school. And they both took off. Actually, one not right away, later on, but the other one just took off and she just started making all kinds of things. So I never I never felt that there was any looking down on the knitting in any way. Um, yeah.
Well, do you remember like when you were knitting in the beginning? Like there was no YouTube back then. So
No.
how were you learning? Like was it mostly from books or was it mostly your mom was telling you how to do stuff?
Well, certainly my mother was there to support, and she was a great teacher in the sense that she sort of let me make mistakes and try, and she would point out how to fix the mistake, but she wouldn't fix them for me. So I think that I learned the intelligence of trying to read the knitting and understand which way the stitches were going. I mean, it's very common to drop a stitch, right? So, I learned quickly. And because she always had knitting magazines around, there were patterns around all the time. Now, obviously, Vogue knitting was a little bit complicated. Um, but there were other ones. I can't remember another one that was an interweave or some other special edition that was around that I remember, trying to make things from. And I think there was a simple sock pattern in perhaps a Vogue magazine or some other one. And so I would pick them up. And then she would, of course, point me in the right direction of like what kind of needles I should use. And I think she facilitated my knitting journey, really.
Well, how
Yeah.
is it now? Like, are you taking classes now? Do you feel like just because you are the lifelong knitter, you experimented with everything and you sort of can figure it out for yourself?
That's an interesting question. I think usually when there are workshops being taught at festivals and so forth, a lot of the classes are, I would say definitely, a little bit simpler and usually I'm going for the yarn, so I don't pay a lot of attention to the workshops. I actually developed a workshop recently, which I gave in New Mexico on sweater modification. So I think when it comes to sweaters, I don't think I would take any, but recently I thought it could be interesting to learn a little bit more about certain techniques like brioche, for example, which I know in a very basic level, um, or shadow knitting, or some other techniques that are just a little bit unusual that I haven't done or haven't done much of. But I don't usually think to take classes.
When you mentioned the sweater modification, so I know you sort of claim not to be a designer, even though there are a couple patterns on Ravelry that you guys should check out when you have time. But how do you approach knitting? So let's say you found the pattern that you like. How close to the pattern will you knit a sweater for yourself?
That's Well, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know if I'm going to answer it directly, but I think that, I mean, I actually counted how many sweaters I have in Ravelry the other day, or garments. I'm going to say garments, adult garments, because I've made skirts as well, quite a few of them. And I had 117. And that's since 2009. I thought, oh, gosh, I've made a lot. I've made a lot of garments. Not all for me. Some of them have been gifts for other people, but obviously quite heavily for me. And yes, I am running out of space. And so I think that, there's just a lot of experience. And when I looked at my 2009 sweaters and my 2010 sweaters, I'm not wearing some of those anymore because they didn't turn out great. They were too big in the neckline, or I made them super boxy looking, or they just didn't flatter me in some way. So not all of especially the earlier ones, I think I have more and more success with sweaters, but I think you're always learning, right? So I think I'll modify a pattern depending on um, how complex it may be and what I see along the way. Like sometimes it's just a question of adding shaping to the waist area. Usually for me, I like to make things slightly A-line. Sometimes if I'm doing the raglan and I come down, if it's top down and I come here and I realize, oh, it's a little bit big or it's a little bit small, I'll modify there. And that's the thing I love about knitting, that you can make decisions as you're going along. And I think it's just a question of stopping and observing and looking, okay, like what's really happening here? Does it look good? Is it to this? Is it to that? And then I might modify things. Obviously, if something is much more complex, or if I'm testing someone's pattern, then there may be less modification, but it still could just be a question of lengthening or shortening or making the sleeves slightly differently. And then you make mistakes, and sometimes you learn really good things from those mistakes. Like I made a top-down yoked sweater. Which one was it? I think was it the striped sweater? I think it was from Andrea Mowry, and I accidentally ended up casting on and knitting the increases for the size below the one that I was intending to make. And it actually turned into a great accident because I realized that I can start smaller here because often with, I have a little bit of a larger bust. So sometimes the necklines can be a little bit bigger. I thought I can start smaller and I can always add more increases, right? So you start to make observations from the way patterns are written, your experience, the mistakes you make. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. Well, the funny story about this one, right? So this is the same sweater that you're wearing. It's very
Yeah.
by Claudia Quintanilla. So this is the second time I knitted this sweater. The first sweater I was knitting, a friend of mine basically like snagged it off my needles pretty much. And she was like, my birthday is coming and I really love that color. So it went to her. But when I was knitting the first time, I misread the directions about the side cables.
Yes.
And so I just skipped all the side cables. And then that first one, I only had one side cable slip going right under the sleeve. And it was like a little bit different look. So this one is for me. And I was like, okay, this is how the pattern wanted it to be. So sometimes those mistakes can be your design idea. And sometimes it can be just accidental improvisation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned my two patterns, and one of them is a skirt, and it's actually not a pattern, it's a recipe because I've made multiple skirts. And I think the first skirt that I made was actually a free pattern and it was a one size only and it wasn't going to work for me. So right then I was like, okay, I'm going to need to change this if I want to make this skirt. And then I started making more skirts because I really like wearing them. And then that's where that came from. And I ended up making a skirt for somebody else. And so actually I made a skirt for my mother. I made a skirt for one of my colleagues. So, that's where I started to realize, sometimes you don't need a pattern. What you need is a recipe to understand, how to make the calculations, how to do the math. So, yeah.
Do you ever I use the hashtag never not knitting jokingly. Do you ever have time when you're not knitting?
Pretty rarely. Pretty rarely. I've had to slow down this year because of an injury that I had. I fell and I broke my wrist, and it slowed me down. I never stopped. And then I've also developed a repetitive strain syndrome in my other hand. So those things have slowed me down. And when I broke my bone, the wrist, I realized because I couldn't knit more than about 5 minutes in the day, and I usually knit 1 to 2 hours. It's usually in the evenings. If I'm home, obviously, if I'm going out, then it's a different story. But most days I'll at least knit a little bit. It's pretty rare. So there I couldn't knit. And it was an interesting exercise because it made me sort of realize a little bit about just savoring the moments and being in the now, so to speak, and just accepting the place that I am where knitting is not happening, and that's okay. But most of the time, I do really enjoy knitting, and it's very much my meditation, and it's very much my peaceful place. I can't knit if I'm really fuming angry. I literally cannot knit. If I'm I don't know. I mean, it's a strange thing. Like if I've been raging about something, or whatever, I literally cannot knit. I literally have to calm myself down a little bit to be able to knit. And then the knitting also takes me to sort of a slightly meditative place.
Well, you mentioned that you like going to the festivals to buy yarn. So I want to ask you a very personal question that I like to ask my guests. Tell me about your yarn stash. What does it look like?
Well, it's in a closet. I live in a rather small house, and all the bedrooms are occupied. So I don't have my own space for crafting. That's something that I would really like to have. And so it's in a closet, and there's a lot of yarn in that closet, I can tell you that. I have a lot of yarn, and I don't just buy single skeins. I buy sweater quantities. So I have a lot of sweater quantities, more than I will probably need in this lifetime, I have to say, I have to admit. Um,
But do you buy with the project in mind, or you just buy because you know
Usually,
it's gonna?
usually I have a project in mind. Usually I think this would be really nice for that. That may change, right? It may change. Sometimes I'll just buy yarn because, for example, I was just in Barcelona for Barcelona Knits. And one of the yarns that I bought, the Shoya yarn, a Spanish yarn, I bought it because I really wanted to have uh, a more rustic Spanish wool. And that one, I didn't actually have anything in mind, but I thought it will become something. And whether it's a sweater or a cardigan, but generally I do. Generally, when I buy yarn, it's thinking about something.
Well, let's talk about your YouTube career. So
Okay.
yesterday I mean, for the past few days, I've been binge watching your channel, and I started with the first episode.
Oh my God.
It was different from what I've seen in episode 89. And yeah, there is 89 episodes out there if you guys want to take a look at it. But it was also very much the same. I feel like some YouTubers, you can see this drastic change from the beginning when they like don't unsure of themselves and they stumble and they don't know how to say something, to like being very relaxed couple years later. You sort of had it from the beginning. Tell me what made you decide to go into YouTube.
So before my episode one, and I probably alluded to it in episode one, I was an occasional podcaster on another podcast called The Two Tangled Skeins. And one of those women on that podcast, her name is Sue, and we used to work together. And we were both, in fact, she introduced me to Ravelry, and got me into this crazy, more active world of knitting. And one day, I don't remember what it was, because my podcast, I started, Little Big Knits, I started in 2017, June of 2017. And so I don't know if it was like 2013 or 2014. We were having coffee one day and she said, "Do you want to start a podcast?" And I looked at her, I was like, "What are you talking about? What are we going to talk about?" "Knitting." I'm like, "Who's going to want to listen to that?" And I was like, "I really don't think so." It was like beyond me. After that, she went ahead and started. And after that, I started watching podcasts. And then I totally understood. She had started watching them already. So she understood what they gave to the community and what they gave to the person doing the podcast. So after a couple of years or a year and a half or so, I said, I wouldn't mind coming on to your podcast once in a while. She was like, "Yeah, let's do it." So I would go on about once a month, and I really enjoyed it. And I can't even quite explain what it is that I enjoy about it. It's just it's first of all, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about knitting. Um, you know, to talk about knitting. It's fun to be able to do that. And then the interactions that come from that, and the community building that comes along with it as well. And we were three people on the podcast. So obviously, we had to limit a little bit what each of one of us said. And I started wanting to be able to say a little bit more. And I started having this desire to have my own podcast. So I mentioned it to Sue one day. I'm thinking about doing this. And she said, "Go for it." And that's where it started. So I had already been in front of the camera a little bit. I had already had a taste of what it was like. So maybe that's why I didn't look quite as nervous
Right. It's
as
different
somebody
though. Like
else.
when you do it with somebody else, there is somebody to take half of the share of the responsibilities, right? So if you have the brain dead moment, or if you forgot the what you're gonna talk about next, the next person can jump in and cover for you. Did you feel it was more difficult to go solo in this respect?
No, I really wanted to be able to spend the time talking about things at my own pace. Um, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed doing it with other people as well. Um, but there was just something in me that just wanted to try it out. And I thought, well, you know what, if it doesn't work out, I just stop. But I actually really enjoyed it. And and I knew that it was time to podcast because I'd start talking to people in my head. Like, I didn't set out at the beginning to podcast every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks or every month. I just did it. And then I thought, and then I'd be walking down the street and I would have finished a project and I could hear myself talking and describing it and talking about it. And then I thought, oh, clearly I'm needing to share that. I'm needing to get that off my chest with everybody. And so that's when I would, figure out when was the right time. It's always on a weekend because I work. And I'd try and get the family out of the way so that I could podcast.
When you talk on your podcast, who do you talk to? Like, who do you imagine as your audience?
That's really interesting. You.
I'm so glad because I do.
It's interesting because I have some non-knitting friends who actually watch my podcast. That blows me away. And I feel honored that they would spend time with me in that way. And I also think they're slightly crazy. And they tell me that what they see, who they see on the podcast is who they know. I mean, in real life, I swear, and I don't do that on the podcast. I'm a little bit, a little different. And obviously, I'm a little bit more focused on the podcast because I'm thinking about all the things I want to say, and it's more measured in the way I deliver and so forth. But I think I'm just talking to my friends, and I think my friends are my knitting community as well. I think of us all being together.
Well, when you prepare for the next filming of your podcast, how much preparation goes into it? Like, how do you organize it? Do you write it all down? Do you put all your whips and all the bags and all the project bags? And you can tell I've been watching it, right? Like, so I'm imagining like that it's all takes time to prepare and put it around and organize it and decide in what order you're going to be talking about it. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I have a notebook. I always have, and I don't put extensive notes in there, but I have, I know what, I mean, most podcasters have an intro that you just kind of get used to saying. And then if I'm not wearing something that I finished, I have, wearing, and I'll put that there, but I'll really just put Violetta sweater, Lamina Como, Claudia Quintanilla. And if it fits something else, like if there's something I don't want to forget, I'll put that there. Needless to say, there's always stuff that I end up forgetting about, it's just the way it goes. And then I do the finished objects, I do the works in progress. And if there's other things that I want to talk about, if it's patterns that have come into my life or acquisitions, or if sometimes I talk about books or movies or things that I've seen, I'll put those there. If I want to mention a podcast, I put those there. I just sort of have things that way. But as I said, because I've already talked to you in my head, often just having the finished object with the yarn and the pattern there is enough for me to remember all the things I want to say. Now, sometimes people will ask me questions afterwards in the comments, and I realize, oh, I never talked about that aspect of the project, or I inevitably forget something. I don't think I'm always as thorough, perhaps, as I could be, or whatever, but it is what it is. So, so there's a general organization. I know what I want to do, and I usually know what footage I'm going to add at the end. I'll have looked at my camera and sort of figured out if there's going to be footage and what it's going to be. And And then once I finished talking, I upload my podcast videos, and then I sort of finish that. And then if I need a break, I take a break, and then I'll come back and add the other footage and decide what music to go with it and so forth. Um,
Is there ever a time when you don't feel like doing a podcast?
Sometimes there might be a slight delay if I really am, like, usually it's more life. I really enjoy doing it. I really enjoy it. And I kind of thought, gosh, can I even imagine my life without the podcast? Like, it's a real part of my life. Not only the actual doing of the podcast, but the community that's been built around it. And the beautiful comments, and the friendships that have come from it. And it's it's such an important part of my life. I think, oh my gosh, what would I do if I stopped podcasting? That would be a huge void, on a certain level. And I still enjoy doing it, and I don't see an end to it. But if life is such that there's, things going on, that there could be a little lag, it might end up being 4 weeks rather than 3 weeks. And vice versa. If I'm super enthusiastic, it might be 2 weeks rather than 3 weeks. But I try to keep it to about a 3 week schedule, and that gives me time to live my life in between and, work on things that I can actually talk about. I couldn't do it every week. And although I sort of stick in my head to somewhat of a 3 week schedule, I also allow myself the flexibility to do it when I want to do it. Because if I said, I will be here every single third Saturday, you will see me, then that would kill my joy.
Right.
There needs to be a little bit of spontaneity for me, from it to keep the flame alive, I think.
You take your viewers on a lot of trips to different countries, to different festivals. When you plan a trip, is yarn always a part of that trip?
No, not necessarily. If I do things with my family, I don't usually subject them to dragging them to a knitting shop or whatever. And yeah, I think that actually, like last year when we went to New York, I didn't even bother. I sort of looked what was around, and there wasn't a whole lot around in Manhattan. So I thought that's fine. I don't always. If I'm going on my own and I know that there's something interesting nearby or something that I've never been to, like the last time I went to Toronto, I went to Unit Toronto, for example, because I had never been and I really wanted to go.
Isn't it
But
an
not
awesome
necessarily.
store? Isn't it such an awesome store?
Oh,
I
it's so beautiful.
had such a wonderful time there.
Yeah, great selection. And I was also really inspired by all the sewing fabrics and stuff. So I thought, okay, this could be a dangerous place.
Well, let's talk a little bit about it, because you don't just knit, you dabble in a lot of other things. I saw some visible mending. I saw some project bags that you were sewing, and you also paint, I believe, and you do some other things. So tell me about your other hobbies and how you balance all of it.
Painting. Do I do painting? I think I may have once a long time ago. I used to do pastels more and drawing, um, which I haven't done in a long time. And I've been wondering lately, is that something I need right now? How do I, and I met my husband doing pottery. So there's a lot of pottery in our house that actually there's a couple of pieces right here. That dish is one that I made years ago. And there's a little urn beside it, behind there, that you can't really see. We met doing pottery, and that was a long time ago, and I had more time then. I wish I had more time for everything I want to do. I certainly would do a lot more if I had more time. I need to quit my job. um, I do it when I can, and I think it's about being creative, and I think we can be creative in a lot of different places, right? It's not only in our making. Our creativity, I think, comes through in our cooking. It can come through. It can come through in the way we approach problem solving, in how we choose to decorate for Christmas, whatever. I feel like I definitely have a really substantial need to be creative, I think. And I really think that just shows up in a variety of ways for all of us. Some people may have a little bit less need to create, or maybe a lot of people think they're not creative, but I think that creativity comes through in a lot of different ways.
Right.
Um, so I think what I do sort of depends on what's inspiring me. And yeah, just different phases in a way, right? And some crafts may come and go, others, well, like knitting has just stuck for my entire life. Um, some things are also more physical and you can't do them all the time or require a little bit more space. But I think I just try to go with the flow. And knitting is my primary source, but then I get taken in other ways here and there, right?
And you're really talented with other ways because I really like those project bags of yours.
Oh, actually, I have I thought maybe I was going to be knitting, but I'm not knitting. But there's this one that I had, the stitching that I had done that this was a real moment of inspiration. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing to make. And right now I feel like there's a little bit too much going on for me to be thinking about my next stitching project, but I think it'll come when it comes. And I just kind of go
Right.
with the flow.
Let's talk about the community that you gained through YouTube and through your Ravelry group and through your Instagram. Did that surprise you, the popularity of your channel and how many people subscribe to your channel and how many people watching those videos?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on episode 1, I started with a little bit of a community because people came over from Two Tangle Skeins right away. So that was really wonderful. And I've been doing it for 6.5 years, right? So it's built up over time. And I know there are some people who've been there from the very beginning, and that blows me away. It blows me. I mean, I certainly have podcasts that I've been watching for years as well. So I understand it, but it's a different story when you're the one that people are loyal to or truly enjoy. And I'm really always blown away by the generosity that people show through their comments on YouTube, for example. It just blows me away. And I've been brought to tears multiple times in the last 6.5 years of just reading things that people have said, or receiving gifts that I wasn't expecting, and people have just written beautiful things. And I think this community has such an amazing, amazing potential for uplifting one another. It's amazing.
One of the recent episodes that I saw, I think it was the last one actually, somebody criticized your vest and said, no, it's too boxy, it doesn't fit, I don't like it. How do you deal with negativity in comments?
I didn't take that as negativity. And I agreed with her, actually. I don't actually like the way the vest worked out. So I was sort of like, I'm glad somebody else, because people are really, they're positive and generous, and they're trying to say, no, it looks great. And I'm like, I just don't think this looks great. And so it was kind of nice to have somebody go, no, it looks like crap. Thank you. That's what I thought too. Um, there isn't a lot of criticism. I don't consider that particular thing criticism. Or if somebody says, the sound was a bit off today, or I might realize, oh, I forgot to increase the volume when I was editing. I don't consider that criticism. Um and I haven't received a lot of criticism, but when I have, um I've either decided to say nothing, or if I felt that something needed to say, I just said it directly to the person. Like, I don't, I think that there are a lot. I've had I've had a few things, but not a lot. And so I think in the moment, I think it's really hard, even though you get 99 positive, wonderful comments, you get that one negative thing, especially if it is really a criticism, you know, that it's hard to get it out from under your skin. And it's hard to not give it attention. And so I will usually sit with it a little bit and then decide, do I need to say something or not? Um, and if I need to say something, I say it, and I say it respectfully and kindly, but I just, I set my boundary essentially. I've had a few comments over the years that have been really inappropriate, not necessarily towards me, just racist types of things that people have said, and they get deleted. I just feel like you don't have a voice on my channel with something that's truly offensive. So for me, there are different categories, yeah.
When you come to the festivals and people recognize you, does that feel weird to have that like celebrity feeling that somebody is coming to you and tells you, oh my God, I love your channel?
Does it feel weird? I really love to meet the people that watch the channel. So that is really nice. What actually makes me sad is when people will write me after and say, I saw you, but I was too shy to say hello. I'm like just this ordinary person. I don't think of myself as anything out of the ordinary. I really enjoy meeting the people. It's become interesting because the last couple of times that I've been in a public like knitting event, there have been more people that have come to say hello than in the past. And I was sort of like, wow, okay, this is interesting. But at the same time, I really enjoy it because it's nice to say hello to people and connect with people, because in the end, they feel like they know me, just like I feel like I know another podcaster that I watch. But that's their moment to be able to say hello. And I particularly enjoy that. And if I can, I usually will say that I have, between this hour and this hour, you can find me in this spot if you want to come and say hello, because you don't always bump into people when you're at a festival. So I just think it's nice to give people a chance to say hello, because we are all part of a community together. We all sort of play a different role and engage and give to the community in different ways. And so I think that's an opportunity for them to say hello and give it back in that way as well.
What do you get out of having a podcast?
That's a really, really good and very existential question, because from day one, as I said a little earlier, I don't even actually know, like, why do I like this? What do I, what am I getting from this? And I can certainly say over the long haul, it's been very much about community, very, very much. And I feel like such a part of this community, and I think it's definitely in part because of podcasting. I really enjoy the interactions. It's very affirming for sure. Sometimes I'll finish filming and I'll be like, oh my God, I just sound like the biggest. And then I edit it and I go, okay, that wasn't so bad. And then I get these comments saying, that was so fabulous, thank you so much. And it's really affirming, and you are putting yourself out there. And there are moments where I'm like, I can't believe I just said that. That just sounded silly, or or whatever. And so there's a lot of affirmation, that's for sure. And it's just, as I said, really wonderful to talk about knitting and with people who want to hear about it.
And who get your
And
enthusiasm.
who get it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's for sure, because I met like all my all the people that I now consider my friends through my podcast, because I got to have these conversations. And I remember, like, even at the very beginning, I used to say, like, if not a single person watches this interview, I got to have an amazing hour chatting with somebody who is liking the same thing I like and enjoys the same hobby. So it's good already enough for me, you know. So it's most definitely about community, about meeting other makers, about meeting designers, about meeting the viewers, you know, and having this connection.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It really is wonderful to feel part of something. Um, Especially when you're doing something like knitting that can be extremely solitary,
Right.
but it doesn't have to be. It can be a source of, especially with Ravelry. When Ravelry came out, it really revolutionized the knitting community because it gave an opportunity for people to connect in a way. And then podcasts started, and then Instagram, and so there's all these different ways of connecting with people and meeting people. Um, and it's just wonderful.
I mean, that's why I ask you if it feels weird when you like in the festival meeting some of your fans, because oftentimes I feel like I'm just sitting in my home, right, knitting and then talking to my camera. And then to actually meet people who watch you doing that, it feels almost surreal sometimes.
Yeah, it can feel a little bit surreal and also just really heartwarming. Like it just feels so lovely to meet the people that do watch and that people do watch.
Do you
It's
think
been a lovely journey.
do you think it influences your decisions about what you're going to make? Because like traditional podcasts where you talk about your finished objects, your work in progress, your plans, your acquisitions, it sort of puts you on this path where, like, if you finished everything and you don't have anything on your needles, or if you didn't finish anything and you have like couple projects on your needles, or if you're a monogamous knitter, you have nothing to talk about. Do you feel pressure to have more than one project, or do you feel pressure of finishing something just so you can film?
Not finishing just so I can film, but I can say that I used to be much more of a monogamous knitter, and I have become more of a poly knitter. Um, over time. And I think that the podcast has definitely influenced that. Um, but I don't feel like I need to finish something for the podcast. But the way I knit, I tend to end up finishing things. I tend to knit in sort of like, I'll have many projects, but I give attention in certain ways and then end up finishing things. I don't have many projects on the go. I might have 3 or 4, maybe 5. But usually what'll happen is that I'll start one when one is almost finished, and then I'll start another one. So I think when I was first knitting sweaters in my teens, there were quite a few that I never finished. And I think, probably in the last 15 years or so, I thought I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to be the one that not finishing things, because I feel that there's a level of stress that comes with not finishing things for me anyway. So, generally speaking, I just try and finish things. And if something's not getting finished, then it's probably because there's something about that that's not working for me. And then it's a question of determining, why am I not finishing this sweater? If I want to finish it, then I should just pick it up and do it. But definitely I would say that I started knitting more projects at once. And that was definitely as a result of the podcast, I think.
Do you think your viewers changed you as a person somehow, or like influenced you somehow?
That's a very interesting question. And you're actually making me a little bit emotional. Um, I think the generosity has blown me away. Yeah. Like I remember I never used to comment on podcasters' channels. And it meant so much to me when people commented on my podcast that it made me start to comment on other podcasts. It made me, I think, become more generous in my words because were just so generous in the way they would write. It would just blow me away. So I think that certainly, I think that generosity has had an impact on me. And it certainly changed me in the sense that I have built such a community. Like I have so many friends that I've met. So it's given me a community beyond the people that I've met through other means like school or work or whatever. And that's really been a great source of happiness in the sense I've got friends that are all over the place that I communicate with on a regular basis. And it's
How do you perceive other YouTubers? Because there's so many knitting podcasts out there. Do you see
yeah.
them as your competition? Do you see them as your colleagues, as the source of inspiration, as source of ideas of what else you can try and how you can improve your podcast?
I honestly think that there are podcasts for everyone. I really don't. I feel very much that part of a podcasting community. I feel very much that other podcasters are my colleagues, and they are a definite source of inspiration for me in my knitting. I feel enabled by many people, and will stop and go and look for something because they've mentioned it. I need that. I need to know what that is. And I'll be clicking to go to the patterns that they talk about all the time. So definitely an amazing source of inspiration in terms of my knitting and also sometimes in terms of techniques, because I'll be like, oh, I really like the way they just did that. That's really interesting. Or even from a technological perspective, I'll be like, how did they just splice those two things together? If they're doing some sort of editing that I haven't done and I'm like, I like that. And how did they do that? Then I might try and figure that out. But I really do feel sort of like a natural affinity towards my podcasting colleagues because it's like we're all doing the same thing.
So I just threw an offer at you that you're going to think about for January of maybe us collaborating on a project. But meanwhile, what are your plans for next year?
Well, I have been thinking about this a lot. Certainly, I have one goal, and it's a continuation of something that I did this year, which was to try and not buy yarn except for in special occasions. So I didn't buy yarn from Knit City, Montreal until I went to New Mexico in the fall and Barcelona. And then I kind of went a little overboard in Barcelona. So I'm feeling very much like I want to use the yarn that I have because I buy beautiful yarn and I want to use it. So that's certainly an overarching goal. And there are just so many sweaters that I want to make and so many things that I want to make. It's crazy. They're just like swimming furiously in my head. Certainly one thing, I have some Nutiden yarn, which is the unspun yarn from Sweden. And it's something that I really want to use up. I really want to use it. So I'm expecting to use that up. Oh, now that you've got me thinking about this, I'm like, what else was on my list? I would like to make something with the yarn that I got in, some of the yarn that I got in Spain. So there's the Ilia pullover by Orlan Suk. It's by Orlan Suk, right? I believe. And it's a yoke pullover. And I got some yarn at Barcelona that I really want to use for that. So that's definitely one. And then another one that I would like to make that I saw a version of the sweater at Barcelona and actually got the yarn or a yarn that would be perfect for it, which is the Tandy by Justina Lorkowska. And so those are, three of the sweaters that are sort of swimming in my head, but there are so many things that I'd like to make. I know that I'd like to make a colorwork sweater. I didn't make a colorwork sweater this year, and I'm really itching to make one, and I have a few sweater quantities that I bought specifically for color work. So I haven't settled upon anything yet, but I feel a color work sweater coming on. And so I've sort of got a list of things that I've been thinking, okay, these are things that I'd like to make. And I sort of decide by either yarns that I want to use, or I sort of think, there's a sweater that I've been wanting to make for a while. There's a pattern that I bought that I still haven't made that I'd like to make, and deciding, what do I need in my wardrobe? Do I need a little bit of this, or do I need a cardigan? Do I need vests? There will probably be a vest somewhere in 2024 because I love vests. I wear them all the time. So
I see some knitting in your future.
you see knitting in my future. It's written all over here.
I want to thank you so much for being my guest today. I had a blast talking to you, and I hope we're gonna collaborate on something interesting, perhaps next
Yeah,
year. Keep me
definitely.
posted on that, and
Yeah.
sure we'll meet at one of the festivals sometime soon.
Well, and I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to go to Toronto in the end, because it would have been lovely to meet you there at UNIT.
Yeah,
And I'm hoping that they'll have more events and I'll be able to go. But yeah, let's hope that we can meet sometime in 2024.
it sounds great. Thanks so much, Selma. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Irina.